Lying between the Brynderwen Hills and the beautiful coast of Bream Bay, the town of Waipu is today the centre of a thriving rural community which fills to overflowing during the summer as visitors flock to its beaches. But here at the Waipu Museum, you'll discover the remarkable story of the Reverend Norman MacLeod and the 900 Highlanders who followed him to Waipu. It's a story that began in Scotland over 200 years ago, where the Highland clearances had led to widespread persecution and enormous hardship.
The people were living in mud huts or stone huts, with the cattle living within the same building with no dividing wall, and over the winter the cattle would stay in the house over the winter. The manure would pile up because manure was far too precious a commodity to lose to put on the field. So, I mean, disease, famine were rife.
The Highlanders were the victims of a new economic order which put profits before people. A shepherd with a couple of dogs could now manage estates that once supported dozens of families. Those who couldn't emigrate were driven to the coast.
The coast around Scotland is barren. The west coast of Scotland is not the easiest land to farm. I mean, Scotic itself, if you translate it from the Norse, means a rocky bay. I mean, that's not somewhere you're going to want to farm off, out of choice.
Crowded onto poor coastal land, the Highland farmers had to scrape a living from the unfamiliar and dangerous seas. As their living conditions deteriorated, dissent began to grow up and down the coast, and in Assynt, the voice of the charismatic preacher Norman MacLeod was often raised against the harshness of landlords and the corruption within the church. In 1813, his fiery sermons got him sacked from his teaching job in Ullapool, and he faced a bleak future back home. Glens, once filled with people, were now filled with sheep, and the herring fishing had failed. The track from Loch Broom to Ullapool became known as Destitution Road. In 1817, Norman and a group of followers left for Pictou in Nova Scotia on the Francis Anne. They were not only farewelling their loved ones as they sailed out of Ullapool, few, if any, would ever see Scotland again.
People were saving the money and going, and they were willing to brave the journey, which in itself was a huge undertaking, and the immense undertaking of setting up when you arrived there, which in Canada, with the cold, the forest, the people had never seen before in their lives, but they did it.
After surviving a storm in the middle of the Atlantic, they arrived in Pictou to find a busy port full of bars, brothels and gambling dens. Norman settled out of town near West River, and although still not an ordained minister, he began to preach, and his sermons enraged local ministers. He was sued for defamation, and when MacLeod refused to pay the fine, his property was seized. His followers, already unhappy with the land available in Pictou, decided it was time to move on. At Loch Broom, the Normanites built a boat called the Ark, and in 1819, a small group of men set sail around the coast of Cape Breton. One story says they were heading for Ohio, another that they were just scouting for better land. When they sailed into St. Anne's Bay, they found a sheltered harbour teeming with fish and almost no people. Within 2 years, they had a church and a school. Norman MacLeod gave lessons in return for work on his farm. For many, this was their first opportunity for an education. New arrivals from the Highlands were drawn to the settlement.
People followed him. I think they were used to the clan system where they had a chief, and I think in many ways Norman MacLeod was sort of the local chief in the clans in this settlement.
By 1827, the school at St. Anne's had 110 pupils, and Norman MacLeod was finally ordained a minister, although his relationships with other churches were less than cordial.
I think there were 3 different churches as far as Norman was concerned. One was the old Presbyterian, the other was the Free Church, and the third one was Norman's church.
St Anne's flourished, but in 1846 disaster struck. Potato blight was followed by failure of the wheat crop. The community petitioned the Governor-General for relief. Not enough came.
The general destitution has made it impossible, even for the most saving, to shut their ears and eyes from the alarming claims and craving of those around them, running continually from door to door with the ghastly features of death staring in their very faces.
As the famine spread, letters from Norman's son Donald in Adelaide suggested that the community should move to Australia. MacLeod was almost 70 years old and his wife Mary was ill. But by mid-1849, they'd begun to build a ship that would take his family and his closest friends to the other side of the world.
All our best friends here are desirous of either accompanying or following us. I do not know what more important duty I could fulfill for them in the business of this life than to assist and accompany them from this now desperate and dreary place to a kind of comparative paradise.
It took almost 2 years to complete the Margaret, but by October 1851 she was ready to sail. At Sermon Rock near English Town, Norman MacLeod said his final farewells. The passengers would spend 6 months crammed together on the Margaret. Food had been dried and preserved over the summer, but no matter how well prepared, this was still a voyage into an unknown future. The following spring, the second ship left Bedeque for Adelaide, but as the Highland Lassie made its way down the coast of Africa, things were already going wrong for the passengers of the Margaret. They'd moved to Melbourne only to find themselves in the middle of a gold rush. And being surrounded by gambling and prostitution seemed a long way from the promised land. Then typhoid struck. Norman MacLeod had already buried 2 sons in Cape Breton. The typhoid outbreak claimed another 3.
The toughness of the man absolutely staggers me, you know, how he could keep going in the face of disasters.
Norman began land negotiations with the New Zealand government, and the reply was promising. The Margaret and the Highland Lassie were sold, and Captain Murdoch Mackenzie bought the Gazelle to take them on to New Zealand. It wasn't long before they were sailing up the coast from Auckland to Waipu. Part of the agreement with the New Zealand government meant that land was set aside for friends and relations still in Cape Breton, and there were many keen to follow the first settlers. The Gertrude arrived 3 years after the establishment of Waipu, and the following year, the Spray left from the shores of Bouladdery Island. In 1858, the Breadalbane arrived, and then, 2 years later, the final ship set sail from Cape Breton. By the time the Ellen Lewis arrived in New Zealand, 934 people had made the journey from Nova Scotia.
I shuddered to think what their first year or 2 would have been like. Their first winter, it would have been pretty sloppy business, I would think. But you know, as soon as they could, they set up their village life and their church and schools, that sort of thing.
Waipu continued to grow, but in 1866 the community was rocked by the death of the man who had led them for almost 50 years. The Reverend Norman MacLeod's final words were, "Children, children, look to yourselves. The world has gone mad." In spite of Norman MacLeod's fears, the community prospered, and the descendants of the migration now number in their tens of thousands. Their Scottish heritage is celebrated in the annual Highland Games, and the Waipu Museum is dedicated to preserving the story of the heroic voyages of their ancestors, one of the most remarkable migrations in the history of the world.